All right. Thank you, everyone. We have a very, very exciting topic today, and I'm so glad to have you here. Uh, we will talk about a very, very interesting topic that we see more often in the market being discussed at the moment, because there's a lot of change going on, driven by technology. 2020 has been the year of change because of COVID and whatnot. So we have seen an entire generation of disruption happening in front of our eyes. But to set this in context, technology has been evolving at a rapid pace for over decades now. And just a very quick metric over here, compute power has increased trillion-fold over the last 50 years. And that's not the speed of change we will see in the future. We will see much more, because as we move towards quantum computing, we will see another trillion-fold increase, not in 50 years, more like in 10, 15 years time period. That's what we are dealing with, rapid change in a short amount of time in the market. A lot of technology waves came along the way in the last 50 years. Some of them took 30 years to mature. Some of them took 20 years. But now we are in an era where a company which is 10 years old in the technology space is considered to be there for eternity. And it doesn't take long for you to lose the competitive advantage in the market, because there's a lot of competition, a lot of things just come into the market in a very, very short amount of time. So we thought that this would be a great topic, because Agile by Design is our partner, and together we work with many organizations to drive transformation. We have done several projects together and delivered great results in these organizations, but we constantly get asked this question, that how do we organize our people, product, processes? How do we deal with this change, and how do we deliver value to our customers? So it's a very important question that all these organizations are trying to address in terms of how to deliver value, how to innovate, and not just that. It's much larger context now. How do we make things meaningful? What is the purpose of our being? What are we doing for the customers? So we will cover most of these concepts in today's discussion. I have a great host today. I'm joined by Jeff Anderson. He's the president of Agile by Design. He has over 17 years experience in leadership, consulting, and he's the author of 2 books, Lean Change and Organize Forward. So I'm going to start off, Jeff, with a question to you. How do you see us grappling with this change, and what has this year been, 2020, for the organizations in your perspective?
Well, it's just following through with the truism that the only constant, something that we'll talk about through this presentation, the only constant is accelerated change. Anybody who's got a lean background or an agile background, or sort of, is interested in design thinking, any of those kinds of, frameworks and mindset, have been talking for the last, more than the last decade around how the markets are accelerating, product life cycles are shrinking, globalization, competition, technology. But what's really interesting is, I'm sure a lot of us didn't realize that, uncertainty was going to, well, a lot of us knew that uncertainty would come from the environment, but none of us were really prepared for the amount of uncertainty that would be introduced thanks to things like our current pandemic and the rapid change that that's had on business models, on entire business segments that are basically shut down. Others are pivoting rapidly. Others are massively accelerating their digital footprint. So it seems like the entire world is conspiring around us to make things uncertain. Change is not just about the positive. There's some negatives here as well. So I truly believe that for organizations to be ready for this change, they not only have to just change the way they're organized, they have to change why they're organized. There's a kind of a new business logic that is starting to, at least, I won't say it's taking hold, but it's starting to become a much more common thing, which is, how do we create value not only faster than what the market wants, but more sustainably as well. And so that's going to require a huge rethink in the way we get organized, why we get organized, and how we know whether that's working for us or not.
Jeff, this is a very interesting perspective that, like you mentioned, that we keep hearing about the new normal and the whole world getting topsy-turvy, but you're framing it as, yes, this is change, but this is not fundamentally uh, a disaster. It's the change has been there all along. It's just an accelerator, right?
Absolutely. And that's something I'll get into in our session. I'll give us a bit of a history lesson and try to frame some of the things that are happening now in a bit of a longer lived context. And that hopefully will, in a way, put people at ease that the things that we're talking about are not so revolutionary. They're really evolutionary. It's just sometimes evolution happens in uneven jumps. It's not always a small, stepwise increment.
Perfect. So with that, we will kickstart the session. And what I will request the audience is to make it as interactive as possible. Please stop us at any point in time. You can just keep sending your questions, thoughts, comments in the chat window. I'll share them. We will have a discussion about it. But let's make it much more interactive than a typical lecture style presentation.
I'll second that. Given that this is virtual, I'm used to having sessions in audiences where I can look at reactions and then stop and say, hey, I think there's a question in the room. It'll be a little harder for me to do that here. So I encourage everybody to ask questions at any time. I'm also going to be asking the audience lots of questions. So I want to see what you guys think as well. So just a bit of what we're going to talk about in a nutshell. I'm going to kind of frame what I call this new or even not so new way of thinking, in a bit of a historical context. What's been happening, in terms of the last 100 years from an organizational evolutionary perspective. Obviously, I'm going to talk a bit about Agile. I'm from an organization called Agile by Design, but I want to make sure that I frame Agile in terms of what it is, what it's done for us, and more importantly, what it hasn't done for us. Finally, I'm going to talk about some things that we can do to build on some of the successes of things like Lean and Agile, and really move how some organizations have moved to the next level and what they're doing to help organize forward for today and in the future.
Perfect.
So let's talk about this new normal, and I'm going to sort of frame it as not being so new. So when people see this, this is way back in the industrial era, over 100 years ago. At the dawn of the last century, organizations or people started providing value in a very different way. They started doing them inside of larger institutions. John Taylor came up with something known as the scientific management method. And what he did is he came up with an approach that allowed people to develop value at scale. Can anybody understand, or does anybody here know, why did we do that? What were some of the market conditions that existed over 100 years ago? Anybody in the audience would like to give me their opinion on what things were like over 100 years ago? Maybe their great-grandfather told them, or they read it in a history book somewhere.
All right, so we have a few comments coming in. There was Great Depression.
Yes. There was a scarcity of wealth, that's for sure. Lots of people were poor. What else?
A lot of joblessness.
Yes.
Labor costs were variable.
There's a lot of people who were willing to work. So you had scarce markets and you had a very low material of wealth. These people were also largely uneducated. So you had very few educated people that knew how to organize. Anything else?
I think there's also an interesting comment that at that era, industrialization was driving jobs and in urbanization, and it was organized around large populations or cities where they wanted to create jobs.
Amazing. So I was going to ask people what they think was the predominant challenge of this era, and it was absolutely that. It was to provide as many of the same goods and services as you possibly could for the lowest cost, the lowest possible price, and also to make sure that we can employ as many people doing it. So it was really to create wealth where it didn't exist. How did we go about doing that? What was the predominant mindset behind growing these organizations? If we think about the nature of the work, the nature of the skills, if we look at all of these people kind of working here, what could you comment about the style of the work that they're doing?
All right, so please share your responses in the chat, and I'll bring them up, or Q&A. I think there's one comment is it's labor costs were, it's basically like it's repeated work, low skill, it's like a production like environment.
Exactly. These people are operating almost like machines.
Yeah,
They're
very
all doing the same thing.
process is another one.
Yep,
Separation
absolutely.
by job function, shop floor operations.
Exactly. There's probably a manager off on the side looking at everybody and making sure they're doing it exactly the same way. He was careful not to get photographed because he didn't want his picture taken.
I was thinking the same. It's a heavy QA reliance. It's manual work, and it's all about testing and getting things standardized.
Absolutely. The way that you create wealth in an environment where you have an undifferentiated market is you standardize.
Yeah.
And you scale up by creating better procedures and more bureaucracy. And in this type of organization, you tend to think of the hierarchy, and the smart people at the top, or I'll say the educated people at the top, tell the uneducated people at the bottom what to do. And you drive the cost down by creating larger batches of inventory. You move things you integrate less often, and this works great as long as you're trying to take one type of vehicle. Like on my previous slide, Henry Ford's comment of any customer can have any slide they want as long as it's black. And if that's the kind of market that you're in, you use standardization, division of labor, division of specialists from each other, division of managers from doers, division of planning from doing even, and you have a lot of control in the system. And I want to be the first to say that a lot of agile people will sort of be very anti-command and control, very anti-hierarchy. The idea is not about being anti-anything. The idea here is that hierarchies and command and control and standards work very well in a certain context, but they work incredibly poorly in other contexts. Over 100 years ago, again, at the dawn of the last century, all the way up until almost, the 50s, it created a lot of wealth, more wealth than the previous 1,000 years, maybe even the previous 5,000 years. So, can anybody tell me, if we were to just go into a time machine from, the 1920s, 1910s, and come into today, what does the world look like today? What are some, if we talked about standardization and repetition, how would we talk about, some of the dimensions that we have in today's world?
More chaos, more complex.
Yes, more chaos, more complexity, an increase in uncertainty. What else? What are some of these factors contributing to that?
So keep sharing your thoughts, folks. Let's make it more interactive. More wealth has been created. So I was thinking, as you were talking about, like the previous section is almost like the goal at that point was to reduce, like you said, uncertainty, but that meant standardizing to an extent that there's no creativity required. You are just supposed to do what you are asked to do, right? And if you're thinking too much or creating something different, that's an anomaly at that, because you hurt the Six Sigma process.
That's actually a great comment, Uzair. What people don't realize is creativity drives up costs. Learning drives up price. Conversely, though, lowering costs and trying to be more standardized and trying to separate workers will make things cheaper, but it drives up lead time, makes things take an incredibly long period of time. Now, typically, if you're delivering 100 million batches of something, it doesn't matter if it takes 2 years for it to come out the other end. It's a big hose and a wide hose. But if you try to cut down that hose so it's too short, you've also got to shrink it as well. So agility is about speed of execution, but people confuse speed of execution with lowering the unit cost of something. And the two are quite on opposite ends of the management spectrum. In today's world, the overarching goal isn't to create as much wealth for as many people as possible, as long and standard by wealth I mean standardized goods and services. It's actually to create a unique customer experience that creates sustainable loyalty to an exact and an exacting audience. Everybody wants something different. Everybody's context is different. Everybody has different needs. And so what's happening now is we're seeing not only more products and services in the marketplace, a dizzying array across any business, we're also seeing the life cycle of those products go dramatically down. Can anybody, tell me how long it took for PCs to become ubiquitous? Just throw me a guess. And that would be a relatively modern concept, PCs from, just being, the old 8088s to being relatively ubiquitous in homes.
I think it was order of like 2 decades, I would say.
Yeah, I think someone has their answer. I bet you someone will have a better answer than I do.
Yeah, there's one more answer, 10 years.
Yeah, it's about between 8 and 15 years. You hear different estimates, depending what you mean. But relatively within the frame of decades. So anybody else have kids out there? I'm sure a couple of you do. Are your kids using TikTok? How long did that take to hit the market?
Less than a year.
Probably a couple of months. I don't know. I blinked and it happened. I'm like, what is this thing? What is this thing I have to delete off my kid's phone? Which I didn't do because that would just destroy me as a parent. But the idea of product life cycles are getting incredibly short. We've got all of this competition. What's even more important, if we just forget about the old idea that the markets are becoming more dynamic, is most people are demanding that organizations, especially businesses, play a new role in the world. This whole notion of sustainable economics, closed loop product development, purpose over profit is becoming increasingly important to organizations' brand. It's becoming increasingly important to employees, i.e. the next generation of people. And it's actually getting such to the point that it's getting on the CEO agenda where, organizations, the way they've been running fundamentally around the economics has to be supplemented with a new set of ethics. And it's becoming increasingly prominent and getting, even more kind of exasperated, I can't say that word very well, by the things like the pandemic. People are demanding more for organizations, which are causing organizations to have to stretch in some really uncomfortable ways. Brief history, brief recap of the history lesson. And the real important point of this graph, which I took out of an excellent book called Organizing for Complexity. If you're interested in understanding organizational dynamics, I highly recommend you take a look at this book. Way back in the day, you would go to a person and say, I need a new pair of shoes. And then that individual would build you a bespoke pair of shoes. And that was great because you got shoes exactly the way you wanted them. But they were expensive to do, and a lot of people didn't have shoes. The solution back then was humans. Then, and you saw that picture of all of the people, putting spark plugs into the wheels. We started thinking about humans as cogs in a machine. And then, of course, how do you scale something like that? You either add more humans or you automate through machinery. And regardless of whether your organization was using people or you're using machines, we really thought of the solution being a machine. It's either a people machine or a technology machine. Now, the reason I say this is the not so new normal, as early as the 1970s, when we had computers that took the size of entire floors, but we started being able to get a handle on information. We started being able to say, okay, I've got all these machines, but I need to use software to orchestrate those machines. And that requires somebody with education and somebody who can make judgment. We've started moving back into the age of the human. And, you'll hear things like mass customization. Well, you can't do mass anything without machines. But now the machines are really just infrastructure. They're the easy parts. Humans are now required to make decisions at all levels of the organization for us to actually create value in this new kind of world. And you'll hear this called the complexity model, the uncertainty model. That really is the age that we're kind of living, starting from the 60s and the 70s. It's just dramatically more obvious these days than it's ever been. So, do you want to add any comments or?
Yeah, in a way, as I understand, like we were into the custom craftsmanship before, and then we went mass scale industrialization, which is standardized, and we are back to that. But we are leveraging the standardization that was brought in by this industrial era, but doing it at a massive scale, like you said. It's really massive customization. It's all these experiences in TikTok you mentioned, in Facebook, and all the social media is custom crafted news feeds perfectly for you right at that moment with all the personalization, all the thousands of signals that they're getting along the way. It's tailor made for you, right? And at a mass scale. I think that's the fundamental leap that we have taken since that era.
It's a lot like driving a car on a big highway. The highway is standardized.
Yeah.
They're not changing the concrete every 10 feet. You're not changing the way that the signals are put on the road. There's one set of rules for everybody, but the drivers and the cars are all very different. Some are off-road, some are on-road, some are cheap, some are expensive. What's inside the cars are different. So it's not like standardization is going away, but standardization is being pushed down to the infrastructural level. So when you're using things like cloud or a lot of the other even higher level concepts, open APIs and other things, you're assuming that those things work. How you use them, though, is up to you.
Yeah, this ties back to another comment that was before made by somebody, which is like moving away from the widget makers to the knowledge makers, knowledge workers, right?
Absolutely. We're in a knowledge economy. Even most people, used to treat call center representatives as widgets. You got to get more calls done a day. And a lot of call centers still do that. They measure throughput. Forward-thinking call centers measure lead time to a satisfied customer and the amount of customers that had to call more than once to get satisfied. And what that does is it shifts call center employees from widgets to actually thinking people responsible for customer satisfaction. Um, it's that mindset that we want more and more people to start encouraging or start encompassing if we want them to be truly differentiated in the markets today.
That is a very interesting thought. I'll come to that in a second as we progress to the sections, but I do want to go deeper into the metrics discussion because that is really interesting.
Happy. Um, so here's a true story. A nice big cruise liner, um, uh, you know, tried to steer itself around some shallow waters, got stuck in rocks. This could have been prevented. Everybody who was looking at the information knew they were going to go into the rocks, but everyone but the captain, who said, keep going. And because of the command and control system they had in place, the organization was dumber than the sum of all of its individuals. You're all somewhat anonymous. How many people feel like they've been in that situation where the place they worked as a whole behaved a lot less intelligently than any one of the individuals who are seeing what's going on? Anybody want to volunteer? How many people put up their hand and say yes? Is there?
Let's see.
I hope I saw someone raise their hand. That's someone that works in my organization, so that might not be a good thing. But still, I'm sure there's a couple of you who've been in that situation more often than they liked. Um, I find this to be a really good metaphor for big organizations because you're built for efficiency. You're built for scale. And scale is great when you want to get across the ocean. You want to move a whole lot of products and get them to a whole lot of people. But scale will work against you if you're trying to learn from your customers, understand what their real problem is, understand what the right solution is. Because by the way, most customers know their problem, but don't know what their solution is. They'll tell you what they want, not what they need. And then learn faster than your competitors so that you can be successful, not build something that's going to sink your business, something that nobody wants. And it's really hard to avoid the rocks when you're working at large economies of scale. And so the management metaphor and the systems look very different. Okay, a little bit about Agile. I'm going to start by saying, what does Agile mean to anybody in the audience? What does it mean to be inside of an Agile transformation or to start using Agile, start being Agile, whatever you want to call it? What is Agile to you? Anybody out there?
Well,
what benefits has it brought to you?
feel free to share your comments in the chat section. I'll keep reading. I'm getting few in. like Q&A sections and chat, whatever you prefer. So I'll share
Uzair, you go first.
yeah.
I'm going to
So
be that you go first while people
we
break in.
hear Scrum, we hear Cadence, we hear user stories, and we hear all the discussion about measuring throughput. There's a comment says the ability to change direction at high speed. That's how what it's meant to be actually, right?
Yep. I like that one. That's probably the best answer. I like that. The ability to change direction at high speed. What has Agile meant in some places in your organizations?
So there's one more is the way software development is done. Another one which is interesting is having the right mindset, being flexible.
Awesome. Love it. So for me, Agile is really a set of principles. I've tried to take a somewhat more constrained version of Agile, really thinking about its roots way back in the day when the Agile Manifesto came out, and into a way many people think of Agile now. We think of principles that promote people, being empowered. Especially as we put them in cross-functional teams. We try to get them as close to the customer as we possibly can. We try to give them as much ability to self-organize as required. At the same time, we put a few constraints in place. Please deliver frequently, smaller increments, get feedback more often. We want a lot of, opportunities to improve. So we want people to actually slow down and inspect the current system and adapt based on what they're uncovering and what they're understanding. There's a big idea of engineering excellence, and that the higher the quality is of the software that you build, the faster you'll go. Whereas the faster you go, the lower the software quality will be. So it's start with quality, not speed. And quality will get you speed, but speed will never get you quality. And that's a bit of a counterintuitive concept. And of course, some people call this product owners, some people call this business owners. I like the idea that you need to embed people from the business, or better yet, your customer, as much as you possibly can into the team. Sometimes that means you got somebody full time. Sometimes it means you're working with customers, and going out and reaching out to them. Sometimes you've got floating people, but you've always got this really, really good embedded business representation. Has anybody, if anyone's, and I'll ask you first, what's your comments on, some of these benefits? Like, what do we see here when we do this well?
So what I see in the market often is, yes, we have seen the cadence shift from 6 months based or yearly releases to frequent releases, yes. But many of the promises that you have listed down here don't actually end up materializing. Like getting feedback frequently, for example. What we see in the cadence in 2 weeks Scrum-based model is feedback is from your developers or your product owner, or at best case scenario by the business. There's no customer involvement whatsoever. So I think many things are actually lost in the translation, right?
So I'm going to list a few here, and anybody from the audience, if you want to weigh in. So we do get people delivering software after a decade and so of mainstream Agile development. Most technology organizations are better at delivering software. The teams are more able to respond to the ask from their business stakeholders. They're able to respond quicker. People are generally happier in most cases. There are some where they're not, but in many cases they're happier. The quality of the software tends to get better when the engineering practices are followed. And the business stakeholders tend to be happier because they're actually getting something without having to wait 3 years for it. They're still not always happy with the end-to-end outcome and the overall pace of delivery, but they are shown things more often. They're given more chance to give their opinion, and we've got some good benefits. Most Agile transformations I've been part of, have been very heavy on the practices, very heavy on the roles, looking at, incremental kind of, shift-wise changes in structure and leadership, but it hasn't gone nearly far enough, in my opinion. I wonder if this resonates with anybody who's been part of an Agile change. Often we'll be asked to go in and change the technology function. Maybe only the application development function. Sometimes it's only the delivery function. Like it can get really fine-grained where we're asked to go and help. And a lot of organizations may have director, VP level support, but the rest of the organization is fundamentally not bought in. So what ends up happening is you start standing up agile teams that at first start to get very, very good momentum, but then quickly become blocked. And they're blocked because of, even though they have a product owner from the business, there's really 9 people in the business who own the end-to-end outcome. There's the part of the business that is responsible for communicating with the customer. There's the part of the business that's responsible for the channel. There's the part of the business that's responsible for operations. And there's that other person who's responsible for the product. And it's just a dizzying array of stakeholders. And all they've done by putting a product owner in is, kind of pushed that, proxy one. Like right now, the product owner has ended up being considered part of the delivery team. Oh yeah, that's a delivery function. He's not part of the business. She's not part of the business. And the product owner ends up talking with the rest of the business as the business. So, while we've gotten some benefits, the fundamental problem with Agile is we often put Agile methods and practices, and in a limited case, some roles inside of a traditional organization.
So what we see here, Jeff, often when we work together in these organizations is we talked about feedback, right? And getting the feedback from business becomes a lengthy exercise because you have to hop through, get many stakeholders into a room and get their opinion. But more importantly, like customer feedback becomes layers deep that you have to go through marketing or our user research teams. And it's a week-long activity to even commission a simple usability test, which was supposed to be the essence. To move fast, you have to get feedback much frequently and do rapid experimentation, right?
A lot of agile methods, Scrum in particular, is based on the premise that if I change the way the teams are and I give the teams the right authority, then those teams will be impeded, which will create organizational momentum for the rest of the organization to successfully change as well. And that has not been my experience. I'm sure that has been some people's experiences, but I don't know a lot of them that have had that experience. What's ended up happening instead is that people have used the agile method only within their frame of reference. So they're trying to operate in an agile mindset, but to your point, they're working with business proxies who are still governed by very traditional thinking, who aren't necessarily talking to users every day. And that's fine if you're in a really well-known space, a well-known product space, and you're just delivering more of the same. But I think most of us know we're not in that space. We're always doing something a little bit new. And what your users want, or better yet, what your users need will surprise you. They don't even know. They think they know. My favorite quote from Steve Jobs is actually Steve Jobs' favorite quote from Henry Ford, which is, if I listened to my customers, I would have built them a faster horse, because no one knew to want a car. No one had any idea. And so people actually don't know what they want. Sorry, what they need. They just know what they want. And those are two very different things. And that learning doesn't happen. From a mindset perspective, you see a lot of agile changes are about more. I want to be faster. I want to get more stuff done. I want to get it done for less. I'll even hear that a lot. Agile is really not about doing any of those things, although it does get you there eventually. It's about creating the decision-making power so that you get less done. You want less output, but correct outcomes, because you're doing the right things and you're actually saying no to a whole bunch of the wrong things. And that decision-making power almost never happens within, a technology organization. It happens much farther up and much farther to the left. Our support organizations also, you typically are not asked to be part of the transformation, the budgeting, HR, sometimes even the other technology functions like operations and infrastructure, legal, compliance. A lot of these people are still, they haven't even been approached and educated on what the new model looks like and the imperative for change. So any real successful, increase in agility has to involve all of these people.
So let's take a pause here and see if there's questions from the audience. Let's make it a bit more interactive. How has your experience been of transformations in your organizations? Are you seeing these trends that Jeff and I are talking about, or is it any different? So feel free to share your comments. So I have a question, which is, how do you effectively make people recognize that they need to do something different? Which goes back to your ship analogy, right? It's like
Yeah.
going in the wrong direction. Some people know it, but collectively they're moving towards that nonetheless.
One of the things I've been working on is how do we connect the need for agility with the CEO agenda? And one of the items in the CEO agenda is the move uh, from shareholder value to end-to-end stakeholder value. And the move from thinking of the market as in terms of my customers and my users and thinking of the market as the entire ecosystem. And so this is something that's been gaining an increasingly amount of awareness and traction over the last 5 years. And, again, has been highlighted with things like the pandemic around the need for a new normal in organizations, both in how they're structured and how they actually integrate with the market. And there's some great use cases out there of both companies that have done really well. Patagonia is an awesome example. You won't see the word agile or lean anywhere there, but this kind of what I'll call organizing forward mindset. Bertsorg Home Healthcare is another one. There are also some more familiar organizations who are on the journey, but not necessarily all the way there for sure. Things like PayPal, your classic, but not all of them. Technical organizations. Like a lot of them, I would say, have significant issues, but some of them are doing quite well. Zappos, Airbnb. But even looking at more conservative organizations, picking on Mastercard and Procter and Gamble, and
Amazon being one of the great examples of like fast
these
innovation.
are organizations who, at the very least, are talking and taking steps towards, what I'm going to talk about is the first principle, which is organizing around purpose. And so if we think about going from this agile concept of, cross-functional teams to make people have better feedback, that is often not a compelling reason to change. But if we move to harnessing the meaning that our workers and our employees already find in their organizational life and distilling that into a concept that people can be aligned behind, that is something that can motivate people at all levels across the organization. So it's a long answer to a very good question. I think we need to start with purpose, and we need to start going higher up and start talking truly what that means. Something I'll get into in a bit.
Cool. So let me get back to the question we parked before, which is when we see agile transformations many times in the organizations, the expected outcomes or the measures or metrics that they put in place is around speed, is around productivity, outcome, right? We did not cover this much in detail in today's session, but we were talking about the knowledge economy and the quest for learning. How do you measure learning? I think that's what many organizations haven't figured out, because they traditionally still try to apply the similar kind of metrics that we see from the industrial era, which is throughput, how much faster, delivery times. It's almost like committing to a timeline and moving towards it. And often what we see together in the market is the definition of MVP or the phase is also around timeline. It's like, what can we do in this time? It's not around learning, right?
Right. So the interesting thing about metrics in the knowledge economy is that all metrics are made up numbers. You're not moving real widgets. So you can't say I built 10 cars today and I built 20 cars yesterday. There are a few things you can measure, which you can measure behavior. I had this many customers do this many things. I had this many customers do this many things over this period of time. You can measure, also you can do the same thing, whether that's your employees or your customers or whatever. So you do have what I'll call, assembly line style metrics that you can use in this type of organization, but you have to realize that they're all essentially being used to help generate insight. You can't just go and make a robotic decision around any number. You could see a number going up, but it could mean the quality, for instance, customer conversion, but the quality of the customer might be going down. The long-term net effect of ROI of those customers may be way lower. So no metric can be looked at face value. The metrics can be only used to guide intuition. Once you realize that, it's almost, I have the saying, numbers are people too. And once you realize that every number has to be met with a follow-on discussion, this mindset around generating an assumption and a hypothesis of, if I do X, then Y will happen, and then you need to go and validate that hypothesis. So some simple kind of, metrics at scale are, how many hypotheses and how many experiments are running right now, and what's the lead time on validating those. Again, if you crack the whip and say, I need you guys to do more experiments, people will do more experiments, but you won't get any more learning. So you can't use metrics as a carrot or stick. It has to be just used to guide intuition.
From Daniel, which is like Dr. Goldratt says, tell me how you measure me and I will tell you how I behave.
Exactly. Exactly. Measurements can't be used in any form of extrinsic motivation, or else they become distorted.
Yeah, I think we had a discussion earlier on. Like one of the customers we were working with, the metric was like how many defects raised, right? When you start measuring QA on this metric, their entire purpose becomes raising defects.
Raising defects, exactly. There's no metric, that will do anything more than potentially tell a story.
Yeah.
And storytelling starts to become more important. Metrics can tell you if nobody's learning anything. So if I have, 5 experiments in progress in a 1,000-person organization and the lead times are 3 months, I know I have something to do. But it doesn't tell me what the problem is, where it is. They're still kind of roll up my sleeves.
Perfect. So that takes us to, I think, the next section, Jeff, which is like, how do we deal with this change and bring it about in our organizations, right? We have talked about experimentation, the need for learning, how we need to reorient ourselves around knowledge economy. But what does it look like? How do we?
Well, here's the very scary picture that a lot of people do not end up with after an agile transformation, which we kind of wanted them to, which is you have, a core organization that may still have a hierarchy. In fact, will very likely still have a hierarchy that is focused on 2 things: compliance and mastery. 2 very different functions. So, in this, being at the top of the food chain doesn't mean you're telling more people what to do. It means you've got a lot of experience and you've done things a lot and you've applied your practice to actually creating value, and you know how to help other people do that. And that mastery is used to create, you can call them teams, you can call them pods, you can call them digital garages, micro enterprises, it doesn't matter what you call them, but you're trying to create decentralized organizing structure that is as close to the impact that it can possibly create, as close to those users, and has as little bureaucracy and handoffs and other dependencies as it can possibly have. Sometimes you can do this at the team level. Sometimes you need to do this with sub-organizations. There's lots of different models here. If we take a step back from the way Agile tells you to do it, decentralization and autonomy. I'd be curious, before I get into what are some of the ways of thinking about this that go beyond Agile a bit, why do we think that so many people are reluctant, especially in positions of leadership, to embrace this kind of model? And that's something I'll turn to you, Uzair, and I'll let other people answer while you're kind of giving your own opinion.
Cool. I think what we see in the market together is it's a fear of loss of control. It's they're used to it. They're conditioned to work that way. It's thinking about a new thing gets people nervous, right?
There's a lack of trust.
Absolutely.
Right? There's a fear that, if we don't watch our people and keep control over what they do, they're not going to show up to work well. And even if they did want to show up well, they wouldn't have the capability to make the right decision. And it's my neck on the line if they. So
a few more interesting responses came in, which is they're paid the big dollars to be in the control.
Exactly. That's right.
Perceived fear of loss of control. People are scared of change. They do not want to appear weak, which is an interesting one too.
Yeah. Much of our industrial era management systems, and that's really whenever you see the hierarchy, you are working with over 100-year-old management technology is based on the idea that a few powerful, smart, responsible people can effectively make all the decisions for a sort of a horde of uneducated, less powerful, less intelligent people. Now the beautiful thing about today is we're almost all educated in the organization. Almost everybody has some level of higher education, whether it's official or not, whether it's university or not. You've all been exposed to higher level concepts. We've got a lot more knowledge workers, a lot more people who are used to solving problems. And that's a great thing, because this idea of command and control, it's not about it being unethical or demoralizing. It can be those things, it can be very demoralizing. It's just not scalable in the face of complexity. And the person at the top is, I can tell you, is just as much as people at the bottom of the hierarchy are feeling unempowered, the people at the top are feeling overwhelmed. And they want to actually empower people, but they just don't have the confidence that it's not going to end well. And they're having
Jeff,
trouble letting go.
I do want to take some audience questions, but
Yes.
before we do that, I want you to shed some light on, like, how do we move towards this model, which is like from this command and control to this.
So I think, things like lean and agile, Kanban, all of these kind of, methods and practices that talk about feedback, that talk about learning, they've all got a lot of good things going for them. It's about using those things and repurposing them with a bit of a common frame. So, rather than starting with, I want to stand up cross-functional teams to go and do X for the business. One thing that I'm trying to do and increasingly work with my clients to do is, how do we make sure that what we're doing aligns with why your people already find meaning in their work? There's been a whole lot of research done on purpose discovery, and organizations that go and take the time to talk to their employees to understand what is the purpose of their organization, get dramatic increases in autonomy, in motivation. We've got surveys that say that people would trade more money for more meaning in work. You get people are more naturally able to self-organize. So people that start with Agile don't necessarily find stronger meaning at work. They don't necessarily align to a strong purpose. But people that, organize around the meaningful impacts that they have in the world, and that organize around purpose, end up moving naturally to, if you might not call it Agile, but to a lot of the same benefits and a lot of the same foundational concepts. The second thing is, a lot of people just say, let's stand up some teams or some structure, and we're just going to trust them. And trust, doesn't just come for free. Trust has to be earned. Safety is a concept that, psychological safety especially, is something that organizations have to really work at in order to get that type of soft trust and safety. So I like to call these sort of conditions of choice, or prerequisites of choice. There are management practices that a lot of Agile and Lean people would recognize, such as the advice process, common issue escalation processes, meetings of kind of behavioral norms and conduct that can be used to help increase confidence in the organization, so that we can graduate people into better self-organization, eventually move them into self-management, and we even see, examples of, self-direction, where people are basically running micro enterprises at scale. But this is not a long journey. And there are lots of examples where people have not used any Agile methods, but they've really focused on choice. They've really said, when we're going to introduce change in here, we're going to maximize the amount of choice people make as a part of this change, whether that's, fluidity of roles, choosing which other teams to work with, choosing the solution to the problem, but really creating those conditions of choice, and kind of increasing it. Then the last piece, this is where Agile is really strong, and this is almost where we start with Agile. We want to make sure we have feedback. We want transparency. We want flow of value, so things don't get stuck either in the ideation or in discovery all the way out to the end. And there's a lot of things that we can use, but one thing we want to do is frame it that this is not just about changing our people, the products that people deliver or the way we deliver it. It's also about changing the way we get organized. Very, very hyper agile organizations are able to adapt their structure based on changes in the market. And when you start organizing effectively for change, you're able to say, guys, we are not organized for value. Whether I'm in an agile team or not, the value's coming in a way that's causing a whole lot of handoffs. How do we shift our organizations or our organizing structure so that we're organized for value?
I think this is what we see many times in the market, Jeff. As we have worked together with organizations, that part is a critical piece, which is often overlooked, which is like teams are organized around functions, and there are a lot of handoffs. It's not essentially they're not organized around change. They're organized around the traditional structures or the process or the steps of the software development along the way.
Even when they move into purely, kind of cross-functional teams, then something happens in the market. They were organized pre-COVID, but then COVID came along and none of the agile teams made sense. And a lot of people say, well, I want to stay in my team. Agile teams, we have to stay in the teams forever or as long as possible. And I do agree with the need to team and stability and all that kind of good stuff. But people also, and we can do this through practice and through training, need to build up their organizational resiliency, build up their trust in the organization so that they're comfortable not being told what new team to be in, but to choose the right team that they need to be in to go and solve the purpose of their organization.
Cool. So let me invite some audience questions. If anyone has any questions, please either they can post them in the chat or you could even raise a hand and I can flip the mic to you.
I feel like I should play the Jeopardy music.
All right. Any questions, folks? So I think the one question I am seeing is how is this different from today? Like we get that you have to organize from purpose, choice, and change, but if you could contrast it against how things are done today.
Well, I mean, let's talk about purpose as an example. I'll just pick on any one of these, right? We'll take the traditional organization. The traditional organization, you think about it inwards first. So information tends to go to the top of the hierarchy and it flows down to the bottom. Some conflicting information comes in from the market, that flows back to the top, then the decision comes back down. Someone decides to develop something differently and the market's moved on. One thing that we've done, and by the way, we rarely do this whole with an entire organization. We often take a line of business or a portfolio of things that need to be done, and we say, why don't you rethink your organization outside in? So let's go and look at all of your market actors, and you can see we have a very expansive view of what we mean by market actors. We mean competitors, we mean suppliers, we mean your regulators. What are all of the impacts aligned to a strong purpose that you want to achieve with those market actors? And once you understand what some of those impacts are, we start trying to figure out what are some incremental things we can do now, next, later. Very similar to something that you do in an agile kind of style transformation. And we start understanding what are the capabilities and the structure that goes around those capabilities to go and feed into those impacts. It's a very different way of looking at the organization. And by the way, you don't have to go and change your org model right away. You can really change your organizing structure / operating model. So you keep the hierarchy intact, but you start looking at the hierarchy as something that's responsible for feeding a set of missions or a set of impact areas. Sometimes, all you need is a team. Sometimes you'll need a cluster of teams to go do this. Getting more sophisticated, that core of your organization moves from command and control and starts learning how to be enablers, which go and provide advice, knowledge, and platforms to people on the edge, or travelers, where they come in and they provide capability that's really expensive and hard to come by, but then immediately leave the teams. So just by recasting, even virtually, your organization or your subset of organization this way and tying it directly to the impacts you're trying to make and measuring those feedbacks, you can make a profound change.
So it's effectively like building new org around the actors, like you mentioned, and around the flow of information and the value. by minimizing the disruption and like not creating the entire chaos, but at the same time making it flexible enough that people are moving from their functions into this new micro org, right?
Yeah, every change that you want to do, you want to make sure that uh, it's something that you can flip quickly, because you don't want to be doing this for 9 years. You want to make a quick flip, but it's also something that you want to make sure that you maximize the amount of voluntary movement that you can. You don't want to be telling everybody what team to go into, what practices to start, how everything works. And so the way you, because then you've lost all the motivation. So the way that you get to some outcomes is you tie this to the meaning that people find in their work. And if people agree with, you'll come with a good organizational purpose if you discovered it rather than defined it. And often your employees know what it is. And if you can use that, you'll find that with a bit of facilitation, people will want to go into the place where they can have the most impact. And so there's a technique called open space, that an open space based change, where you get as many people together as possible to discuss what are the big impacts that we need to do in the next 4 to 8 months, and how should we be organized. And we get this kind of self-forming of structure. And don't get me wrong, lots of facilitation and lots of support required to make sure that people don't fall through the cracks. But you want to start with virtuous movement, but you want
Yeah,
to make sure you
I
do it
think
in somewhere where you can do it
my
quickly.
takeaway from what we accomplished together was it's a fundamental difference from being told to do what needs to be done towards working towards the goal that we want to achieve together. And like you said, it's a lot of facilitation, a lot of co-creation, right? Working together towards
If we treat people like children, they'll act like children. Most people that I've talked to in senior executive positions wish that their employees would take more responsibility, but
absolutely.
it's a vicious circle of and I'm not saying trust and don't verify at first. You've got to work on the conditions. This is where we get into conditions of choice and things, and you can do this incrementally. But it starts with giving people the empowerment, and then giving them some more. It doesn't start, as a leader, I wish it was the other way, but unfortunately it's not.
Cool. So, Jeff, we are almost around the clock. I know we do have other interesting concepts to discuss, but let me ask the audience if they're interested in any of these follow-up topics.
These ones, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, purpose, choice, change. So there's a poll on your screen. If you're interested in taking a deeper dive in any of these topics, please let us know, and we're happy to have a follow-up session to talk about that in context of your organizations. So keep your votes coming. And if you have any kind of final comments, thoughts, or suggestions, feel free to add them into the chat before we wrap up the session. Cool, just one more minute. I'll close the poll then. So I have a few polls. Awesome, seems like people want to know more about change and purpose. Cool. So with that, I thank you all for joining us. If you're interested in having deeper dives around how can we organize for purpose, how can we organize through choice, how can we make a minimum viable change, like Jeff was mentioning, into the organization and start moving towards these concepts of agility, driving business value, customer outcomes, and promote learning and really define KPIs and metrics which value learning, experimentation, innovation, rather than the traditional industrial era metrics. Please, we are happy to have a follow-up conversation with you. Here's the email on the screen. Feel free to reach us out and we'll be happy to jump a call with you. So with that, I think we are on time. Thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Valuable lessons and thoughts with us.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.